I'm Rachel Bomberger here at Erdman's, talking today with Alvin Plantinga, who is author of the new book, Knowledge and Christian Belief. Welcome.
Thank you.
To Erdman's. Now, to begin our interview, can you tell us how the book came to be? Because there is a story to where it got its roots. It doesn't come out of nowhere, I think.
Well, it's really a shortened version of another book I wrote called, a longer book, Warranted Christian Belief, which was part of a trilogy of books about Christian belief and about belief in God, rationality, and the like of that. So that's what it is. It's a condensed, hopefully more readable version, more reader-friendly version of that long book. That was like 550 pages. This one is a mere 120 pages.
So there were a lot of people who wanted to read the longer book, but felt a little in over their heads with regard to the length and the depth of it.
Right. It would take too long, it might take the whole summer.
Yes.
This book you can read in, easily in 1 week.
Yes, yeah. I think so. Well, I'm glad you did it, because I really enjoyed digging somewhat deeply, but not 600 pages deeply, into these really wonderful reflections that you have in there. The title of the book, though, is interesting to me. Knowledge and Christian Belief. Now, if you read any of the comment threads on the internet, pretty much on any topic whatsoever, you might come to the conclusion that knowledge and Christian belief is an oxymoronic phrase, that you can't have knowledge and hold Christian belief. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say that that's not true. I think you can have knowledge of Christian belief. If Christian belief is true, then it seems to me one can certainly one can know that it's true. One can also accept Christian belief without having knowledge that it's true, and I think for most of us Christians, of which I'm one, it's probably like that it doesn't come to the kind of full conviction that knowledge requires, but it's a little bit more up and down, a little bit more iffy. But nonetheless, knowledge, it's quite possible to have knowledge of Christian belief. So what I'm really thinking about is a certain objection to Christian belief, which goes like this. It says, whether or not Christian belief is true, and who can know that? That's very hard to tell. But whether or not it's true, at any rate, one can't be sensible or reasonable or rational in believing it. And that's the objection I'm interested in discussing in this book. People
who would say, well, we can't know whether Christian belief is true, but it's intellectually irresponsible at any rate.
That's right.
Or that Christians are simply self-deluded in some way.
Or the belief-producing processes, what makes them believe what they do, aren't aimed at the truth, but at something else, like Freud and Marx suggest. Something like that, right.
You highlight some of the atheistic philosophical objections to Christian belief, and you mentioned Freud and Marx quite a lot. Both of them had strong objections to Christian belief, but for different reasons, and they sort of summarize what a lot of the common reasons given for atheism are. How would you characterize those views?
Well, their basic idea is that whether or not Christian belief is true, and Freud says, for example, who knows? How can you tell whether or not? There's no way to tell whether or not there is such a person as God. But at any rate, whether or not it's true, thus the sources of Christian belief, belief in God in people, are not aimed at truth, but at something else. For example, in his case, he thinks they're aimed at at sort of being comfortable in this cold, cruel world we find ourselves in. We just find ourselves thrown into the world, go orphan into the world, and that's really difficult. It causes us lots of anxiety and so on. And Christian belief, or belief in God, he's thinking of, arises in response to that. So it just kind of arises as a thought, well, this world isn't so bad after all. There's our Father in heaven who created the world and created us. So that's the sort of thing that they have in mind.
God as sort of fantasy wish fulfillment in a hard world?
Yeah, something like that, right, yeah. Sort of a Father in heaven you invent, subconsciously of course, according to Freud, everything important goes on subconsciously. So subconsciously you invent this Father in heaven, and then you feel better about things.
But at any rate, it's something to be cured.
It can be cured, although I'm not sure he thinks that necessarily needs to be cured. It's not really. It's not a malfunction exactly. Now Marx thinks that belief in God is a matter of malfunction. They agree in that they think whatever it is that produces belief in God in human beings isn't something that produces beliefs that are aimed at truth. They're aimed at something else. And in Freud's case, it's a matter of wish fulfillment, but he thinks that's not a matter of malfunction. I mean, that's the way we're designed, so to speak, to be. According to Marx, though, it's not. That isn't the way it is. It's rather that due to the kind of miserable economic situation that people find themselves in, there is a sort of malfunction, a cognitive or intellectual malfunction of belief is produced, and that's where religious belief comes from.
So in Marx's idea, religion actually prevents us from addressing some of these problems in society.
Yes, right. So
right.
In his case, religious belief is, he thinks it's a bad thing on balance. It's produced by cognitive malfunction, and it stands in the way of having a just society. Right.
Now, in opposition to these two atheistic thinkers, you present two theistic thinkers, Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin,
Right.
who offer a very different philosophical framework for understanding belief. Why did you choose these two to be the heroes of the story, and what is their approach that is so helpful?
Well, I would say they're the heroes of this story because they are the heroes of this particular part of reflection on religion. I mean, Aquinas and Calvin are two of the greatest thinkers there have been that have thought about what the nature of religious belief is, where it comes from, why we have it, and the like of that. And they both think there's a kind of natural knowledge of God. We're just created, Calvin says, with a sense of divinity. He says a sensus divinitatis, a sense of there being such a person as God, which is compromised in us because, he says, we've fallen into sin. Being a Calvinist, John Calvin is a really outstanding Calvinist.
He does it very well.
He's about as good a Calvinist as you can find, and Calvinists tend to be enthusiastic about sin. Not that they recommend it exactly, but they think there is a good bit of it around. And he thinks it's because of sin that we don't have a kind of overwhelming, constant sense of God's presence. Nonetheless, we still do have a sense of God's presence, he says, and of course that's the origin of belief in God.
And Aquinas fits into this sort of how?
Aquinas thinks something similar. He says something of the same as Calvin does, but at much less great length. He says it briefly, but he also thinks the same thing, that God has created us with an inclination to see His hand in nature and to form belief in Him.
The title of the book on which this book is based, I think, is a very interesting one. Warranted Christian Belief. What does it mean for a belief to have warrant?
Well, if you think about, what a belief has to be like to be a case of knowledge. So we think we know some things. For example, I know where I live, and I know how old I am, and you and I both know we're sitting here, and this is Erdman's, et cetera, et cetera. So we believe these things. What makes them knowledge? What makes them knowledge is first that they are beliefs, and second that they're true. But third, they've got to have something else, and this something else, whatever it is, that's what I call warrant. So it's what you have to add to true belief to get knowledge. That's what warrant is, right?
How does this differ from, say, justifiable Christian belief, or is it very similar?
Well, justification, I mean, these terms all are used differently by different people. So
Right.
it's hard to say, well, this is exactly what it is. But typically, justification has to do with one's rights, with what one can do and be within your rights, what you can do and not be violating some kind of duty or maxim. So you're justified in you're justified in I don't know, objecting to what somebody does.
Right.
You know, that means you're within your rights. You've got a perfect right to object to that. So justified belief would be belief such that you're within your rights in holding it and accepting it. You're not being irrational or being out of line in some way or another in holding the belief in question. That's what justification is. But that's not the same thing as warrant. You might be within your rights, but still not really know what this thing that you believe. You might be conceived. You might be deceived in some way, or in some other way, not violating any intellectual duty, but still not in a condition of knowing. So justification and warrant aren't the same thing.
Yes.
Justification plus truth doesn't equal knowledge, whereas warrant plus truth does.
So for warranted Christian belief, it would be a belief that you can reasonably hold, having done your intellectual and philosophical due diligence.
Yeah, right,
Okay.
right. It would be at least that, and it in fact would be more than that. It's more than just being justified.
Yeah.
To be warranted, it's got to. Well, I think what it has to be produced by cognitive faculties that are working properly.
Yeah. So the beliefs, the ravings of a mad person would not have warrant.
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
Right. Working properly, but also working properly and aimed at production of truth. So, in the case of Freud, he thinks that when people believe in God, their faculties are working properly. It's just that there are various different sides to the whole set of faculties that produce beliefs, and some of these are aimed at the production of true belief, and others are aimed at the production of something else, like feeling comfortable in this lousy, mean, whatever world that we find ourselves thrown into.
Right.
So the latter don't have warrant. They're still produced by faculties that are functioning properly, but they don't have warrant, because what produces those beliefs in us isn't aimed at the production of true beliefs, but at beliefs that give us comfort or something like that.
Yeah. And yet, obviously, in this book and other books, you argue that Christian faith does, in fact, have warrant.
Yes, I do. I think Christian faith does have warrant, and I mean, provided it's true. I don't argue that it's true in these books. I do think it's true, of course, but I don't argue that it's true. But given that it's true, then it can certainly have warrant.
And then to close the book, you spend some time discussing the things that could be potential defeaters
Right.
for the warrant of Christian belief, which are biblical historical criticism,
Right.
pluralism,
Yep.
and the thorny notion that there is evil in the world.
Right. Right.
Are these really, do they really threaten the warrant of Christian belief?
I think this depends a lot on the person. I mean, it varies from person to person. One thing that warrant requires is that you believe whatever it is we're talking about firmly. So, you know, for example, I'm utterly convinced that you're sitting there and I'm sitting here, etc. There are lots of other things I believe that I'm not nearly as convinced of. I mean, I might think, well, the Democrats are going to win the next election, but I wouldn't bet my left leg on that.
No, certainly not.
Not by a long shot. So that would be a belief which might be true, but it doesn't have warrant. It doesn't constitute knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to our Christian belief, people differ a lot with respect to how firmly they hold Christian belief. And I think the same person, at least in my experience, the same person can hold this belief with different degrees of firmness at different times. So sometimes the whole Christian story seems to me to be just utterly obvious. You know, it just seems so so beautiful and so true and the like. Other times it can seem, you wake up in the middle of the night and you say to yourself, you think, could all this really be true? It's such a elaborate, wonderful, powerful story, but is it really true? So, so one's degree of belief can go up and down. That's my suggestion. But to have warrant at any given time for this belief to be warranted, for it to be a case of knowledge, at any given time you have to be holding it firmly.
So this is a challenge to Christians, that if they believe, they ought to hold their beliefs firmly.
Right, although it's not always just up to you, I mean,
obviously.
Suppose I don't believe really firmly, I can't just say, okay, I believe it.
Gotta work harder.
Right. That's not how it goes. And in fact, of course, the Bible speaks of faith as a gift.
Yeah.
Something that God confers on us. It's not something we just can produce out of our own resources.
Well, I want to finish by quoting you directly from the beginning of the book. Now, you're talking about Kant, but you say, if you want to be a really great philosopher, be sure not to say too clearly what you have in mind.
Right.
Now, have you perhaps failed to practice what you preach in writing this book?
Well, I mean, that presupposes that I want to be a really great philosopher, and maybe I don't. Maybe I'm satisfied to be just a pretty good philosopher. If you're a pretty good philosopher, you can say what you want to say clearly.
Yes.
But if you want to be great, a la Kant, then you have to be obscure.
Well, you are a pretty good philosopher, and this is a really good book. So thank you so much for coming in and talking with us.
My pleasure.